November 1943. A grey afternoon at the Erreppebungsstelle at Recklin, 70 miles north of Berlin. Germany's most secretive aircraft testing facility, the kind of place that does not appear on civilian maps, the kind of place where the roads simply end at a guarded gate and a perimeter fence. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche walks across the tarmac toward an aircraft that should not exist. It is painted in fresh Luftwaffe camouflage, yellow undersides, the black cross of the Reich on its fuselage, the unit code T9 plus a two-letter identifier of the Circus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's traveling collection of captured Allied machines. But the silhouette is wrong, the proportions are wrong, the twin engines are mounted too high on the wing, the fuselage is too slim, and the material the airframe is made of is not metal at all, it is wood. Lerche has read the intelligence reports. He has read the dismissals issued from the highest levels of German Air Command. He has heard Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself rage about this aircraft in private staff meetings. He has heard the official Luftwaffe assessment that this is a propaganda toy, a flying piano, a contraption built by a country that has run out of aluminium and is improvising with materials suitable for furniture. He has read those words, he has noted who wrote them. And standing here on the Recklin tarmac in November 1943, staring at the captured de Havilland Mosquito parked in front of him, Lerche feels something his career has trained him to take seriously. He feels suspicious of his own country. Lerche is not a man who gets things wrong. By this point in the war, his logbook already records more than 100 distinct aircraft types, German prototypes, Soviet fighters, British bombers coaxed to altitude without a single page of manual to guide him. He is the Luftwaffe's most experienced evaluator of captured Allied aircraft, a trained aeronautical engineer whose reports are known throughout the testing community for one quality that makes him quietly dangerous to comfortable assumptions. He tells the truth. When an enemy design is better, he documents it. When his own country's aircraft has a flaw, he says so. His superiors have not always welcomed this quality, but his expertise is too valuable to silence. Within 90 minutes of climbing into the Mosquito's cockpit, Lerche will be back on the ground. He will walk to his office. He will sit at his desk, and he will write a report so long, so unflinching, so technically detailed, that it will run to roughly 40 pages by the time it is typed up and circulated. His commanding officers will read it. There will be silence, there will be a second reading. There will be discussions in rooms where the doors close carefully and the windows are checked, and then the report will be filed, the way reports were filed in the Reich when their conclusions threatened the official version of the war. 2 years and 6 months later, the Luftwaffe will cease to exist as a fighting force. The reason, the specific, documentable, forensically traceable reason, is sitting on the Recklin tarmac right now in November 1943, painted in stolen colors, looking impossibly light and impossibly fast, built from materials that German engineers had stopped taking seriously 20 years earlier. This is not a story about one captured airplane. This is the forensic audit of an engineering miscalculation that consumed an entire national philosophy. This is the report that predicted Germany's defeat in the air war over Europe. This is the culture that refused to read what its own best test pilot had written. And this is what Hans-Werner Lerche saw that afternoon, what he wrote in the 40 pages he sat down to type that evening, and what it cost the Third Reich that nobody with any real power believed him. To understand why his words were dangerous, we have to go back. Not to that November afternoon at Rechlin. We have to go back 4 years earlier, to a moment when an English aircraft designer named Geoffrey de Havilland walked into a meeting with the British Air Ministry and proposed something so unconventional that even his own colleagues thought he had lost his judgment. The proposal was simple and almost impossible. A bomber, twin-engined, fast enough to outrun any fighter the Germans could field, carrying a useful bomb load deep into enemy territory, and built entirely out of wood, not metal, not aluminium, not the strategic materials that every other major air force in the world was hoarding and rationing in the autumn of 1939. Wood, plywood and balsa, formed into a stressed skin sandwich glued together by furniture makers and piano builders and cabinet shops across the British Isles. The Air Ministry's first reaction was incredulity. The second reaction was rejection. A wooden bomber was an absurdity. A wooden bomber was a step backwards. A wooden bomber, the procurement officers told de Havilland politely, was not what a modern air force required. De Havilland kept pushing. He had run the numbers. Wood was abundant in Britain. Aluminium was not. Wood could be worked by craftsmen who already existed in thousands of small workshops across the country, men who had been building furniture and pianos and cabinets their entire working lives. Aluminium required specialized factories, specialized tooling, specialized workers, all of which were already being consumed at maximum capacity by the production of Hurricanes and Spitfires and Lancasters. A wooden aircraft would not compete with that strategic supply chain. It would run alongside it on a completely independent industrial base, drawing on capacity that was otherwise sitting idle. And the wood itself, properly engineered, properly laminated, properly bonded with the new generation of synthetic adhesives that British chemists had been quietly perfecting through the late 1930s, would produce an airframe lighter than any metal equivalent of the same size and strength. Lighter meant faster, faster meant survivable. Survivable meant you did not need the defensive turrets and the gun positions and the heavy structural reinforcement that every other bomber in the world was being weighed down with. Strip out the guns, strip out the turrets, strip out the defensive armor, build the aircraft so light and so fast that no fighter in the sky could catch it. The Air Ministry filed his proposal in a drawer. De Havilland built the aircraft anyway, mostly with private funding, on a quiet handshake with a few sympathetic civil servants who agreed to look the other way. The prototype flew in November 1940. On its first flight, it reached speeds that the test pilots refused to believe were possible. By the time the production aircraft entered Royal Air Force service in late 1941, the de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito was the fastest operational aircraft in the world, and every single one of them was made of wood. The Germans noticed. Of course they noticed. By 1942, the Mosquito was conducting precision daylight bombing raids deep into occupied Europe, into Norway, into the Netherlands, into Germany itself. Photographic reconnaissance mosquitoes were crossing the Reich at altitudes and speeds where the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S simply could not catch them. Night fighter mosquitoes were beginning to appear over the Reich in the darkness, hunting German bombers, ambushing them on their return to base. Pathfinder mosquitoes were marking targets for the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, dropping flares with surgical precision over German cities while flying so fast and so high that the local flak batteries could barely train their guns. And the official German response, set at the highest levels by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself, was to dismiss the aircraft as a stunt, a propaganda exercise, the desperate improvisation of a country that had run out of proper materials. Göring's words on this point are part of the historical record, repeated in multiple post-war accounts by officers who attended his staff meetings. He raged that the British, who could afford aluminium and steel better than Germany could, were knocking together beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory in England was apparently capable of building. He raged that they were getting away with it. He raged that Germany, with its supposedly superior engineering tradition, could not produce an equivalent, and his rage, recorded by men who were present, did not change the fundamental fact at the center of it. The wooden aircraft kept coming. The Luftwaffe could not stop it. And nobody in the German High Command wanted to investigate too closely. Why? Because investigating closely would have required admitting things that nobody at the top of the Reich was willing to admit. This was the situation Hans-Werner Lerche walked into in November 1943, when he received the order from Recklin. A Mosquito had been captured. It was airworthy. It was waiting for him on the tarmac. His instructions were to fly it, to evaluate it, to write what he found. The orders did not specify what conclusions to reach. The orders did not need to. Everyone in the chain of command understood what conclusions were expected. The captured aircraft was supposed to confirm what Göring had been saying for 2 years. It was supposed to expose the Mosquito as a curiosity, a propaganda machine, an aircraft of no real consequence. Lerche walked toward it with that institutional expectation hanging over him like weather, and as he reached the aircraft and ran his hand along the wooden skin of the fuselage and felt how light the structure was under his fingers, he understood within the first 60 seconds that the institutional expectation was wrong. Hans-Werner Lerche was born in 1914 in the eastern reaches of what was then Germany. He came from no aviation family. His father died when he was a young child. His mother stretched a small librarian's pension across 4 children through the catastrophic inflation of the early Weimar years. The boy taught himself about aircraft from magazines he could not afford to buy, reading them on the floors of bookshops until the owners chased him out. He built model gliders. By 17 he was a licensed glider pilot, training in the same youth aviation movement that had produced Hannah Reach and many of the future Luftwaffe's leading aviators. But Lerche took a different road. He went to engineering school. He combined the two halves of his life, the flying and the mathematics, and by the late 1930s he was at Recklin, the Luftwaffe's secretive test center on the shore of Lake Müritz north of Berlin, doing the work that defined his career. His job was to fly anything the Reich needed flown for evaluation: German prototypes, captured Allied aircraft, experimental designs from the long list of projects that ran in parallel through the German aviation industry. By the end of the war, his logbook would record more than 120 distinct aircraft types. He never crashed a single one, not damaged one badly enough to require structural repair, not one. In a profession where the average career lasted 3 years and ended in a smoking hole somewhere on the perimeter of a test airfield, that record alone made him exceptional, and it made him valuable. The Luftwaffe High Command sent him the aircraft they could not afford to lose. They sent him the aircraft whose secrets they most needed to extract. In May 1943, he was formally assigned to the captured aircraft program. He flew Soviet types. He flew a Spitfire. He flew a B-17 Flying Fortress out of a Danish hayfield in October 1943, the famous flight that produced the report his commanders did not want to read. He flew a P-47 Thunderbolt at Rechlin a month later and produced another report his commanders filed and forgot. By the time the captured Mosquito arrived at Rechlin in November 1943, Lerche had a pattern of climbing into enemy aircraft with no manual and no instructor, of working out the systems by engineering logic, of taking the machines into the sky and pushing them through their full operational envelope, of returning to his desk and writing exactly what he had found. His reports had a quality that his superiors had come to find slightly uncomfortable. They never lied, they never softened, they never told the German High Command what the German High Command wanted to hear. The Mosquito was about to receive the same treatment, and by the time Lerche climbed back down from the cockpit and walked to his office to begin typing, the report he was going to produce would be longer than an. But before he climbed into the cockpit, he walked around the aircraft on the ground, and that walk around alone is worth understanding in detail, because it explains why the report that followed had to be as long as it was. The first thing he noticed was the weight, or rather the absence of it. A standard German night fighter, a Junkers Ju-88 of equivalent size and twin-engine configuration, weighed somewhere around 8 to 9 tons empty. The Mosquito sitting in front of him, slightly smaller in dimensions but comparable in role, weighed under 7 tons. The difference was not marginal. The difference was structural. The wooden airframe, properly engineered, was producing the same strength characteristics as a metal airframe at significantly lower weight. And weight in aviation is the master variable. Every kilogram saved on structure becomes a kilogram available for fuel, or weapons, or speed, or altitude. The Mosquito had taken the savings and spent them on performance, and the performance was what Lerche had read about in the intercepted Allied reports and the captured operational documents but had never personally tested. The second thing he noticed was the construction itself. He ran his hand along the fuselage skin and found that it was not solid wood, it was a sandwich. Two thin sheets of birch plywood with a core of balsa wood between them. The whole structure formed in massive concrete molds and bonded together with the new generation of urea formaldehyde adhesives that British chemists had developed for exactly this application. The result was a monocoque shell that was simultaneously light, strong, smooth, and aerodynamically clean, to a degree that no riveted metal aircraft of comparable size could match. There were no rivet heads disturbing the airflow over the skin. There were no panel seams creating drag. There were no manufacturing irregularities of the kind that by 1943 were appearing on German aircraft as the factories deteriorated under Allied bombing and the workforce was diluted with conscripted labor. The Mosquito's surface was almost glassy. Lerche, who had flown German aircraft where the panels were beginning to fit slightly wrong, where rivets sat slightly proud, where the manufacturing variation between batches was visible to an experienced eye, registered the contrast immediately and made a mental note that would eventually find its way into the early pages of his report. The third thing he noticed was the wing. He bent down and examined the leading edge, the trailing edge, the way the wing met the fuselage, and what he found was a wing of extraordinary aerodynamic refinement. Long, slim, carefully shaped through its full chord. The wing was not designed for slow, controlled flight. The wing was designed for speed. It was designed for the kind of high-altitude cruising performance that required minimal induced drag, that required the ability to keep an aircraft moving fast through thin air on engines that were doing all of their work pulling the aircraft forward rather than holding it up. He looked at the engine nacelles. Two Rolls-Royce Merlin V 12S, the same engine family that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane and the Lancaster, and would shortly come to power the American P-51 Mustang, liquid-cooled, supercharged, producing somewhere north of 1,400 horsepower per engine at combat settings. The engines themselves were not unfamiliar to Lerche. He had flown a captured Spitfire. He had seen what the Merlin could do. What was unfamiliar was the way the Mosquito's engine nacelles were integrated into the wing, smoothly fed into the structure, presenting almost no additional frontal area beyond the cooling intakes themselves. Every German twin-engine aircraft he had flown showed obvious structural compromises in the engine installation, brackets and reinforcements and external fittings that disturbed the airflow. The Mosquito's installation looked as if the wing and the nacelle had been designed as a single piece, which in essence they had been. By the time he climbed the small ladder up into the cockpit, Lerche was already revising his expectations. The aircraft on the ground was not what the briefings had described. The aircraft on the ground was a serious piece of engineering, executed with precision, designed by people who understood exactly what they were trying to achieve, and he had not yet started the engines. The cockpit confirmed everything. The pilot and navigator sat side by side, the pilot slightly forward and to the left, in a configuration that gave both crew members excellent forward visibility through a large windscreen. The instruments were grouped logically. The throttle quadrant fell to hand naturally. The controls were positioned where an experienced pilot would expect to find them, and the layout had clearly been refined by feedback from operational crews rather than designed in isolation by engineers who had never flown the aircraft they were drawing. Lerche worked through the systems one by one, reasoning out what each switch had to do, identifying the fuel selectors and the propeller pitch controls and the supercharger settings. He had no manual. He had no instructor. He had only the engineering logic of an aircraft designed by people who thought clearly. And the logic resolved itself within a few minutes of patient examination. If you are someone who appreciates the work of men like Lerche, professionals who flew enemy aircraft and reported honestly what they found, who refused to soften their conclusions even when the conclusions were unwelcome, that kind of integrity deserves to be remembered. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the air war over Europe actually looked like, not the version that survived into the official records, but the version that the test pilots wrote down when they thought nobody important was reading, hit the like button. It keeps this story visible a little longer in front of viewers who care about getting the history right, and that matters more than you might think. He started the engines. Both Merlins caught immediately, idle RPM in seconds, stable, smooth. The sound was the sound of well-engineered piston engines doing exactly what they were designed to do. There was no roughness. There was no irregular firing. There was no vibration of the kind that by late 1943 was becoming an occasional companion in German aircraft as the manufacturing tolerances slipped and the material shortages bit deeper. The Merlins simply ran. Lerche taxied the Mosquito out toward the runway and noted that the ground handling was easy. The tricycle landing gear configuration, with the tail wheel locking cleanly, kept the aircraft tracking straight. Visibility forward over the nose was excellent. He had taxied German aircraft where the forward visibility was so restricted that the pilot had to weave the aircraft from side to side on the ground to see where he was going. The Mosquito did not require that. The Mosquito's pilot could simply see. He lined up on the runway. He advanced the throttles. The acceleration was immediate and aggressive. The aircraft lifted off in a shorter distance than he had expected, which was significant because his expectations had already been adjusted upward from the ground walk around. He climbed, and here in the climb was where the Mosquito stopped being merely a well-designed aircraft and became something else. The climb rate was extraordinary. The aircraft pulled itself upward through the November air over Rechlin at a rate that Lerche, who had flown most of the major fighters in the Luftwaffe's inventory, recognized as comparable to a single-engine fighter rather than a twin-engine bomber. He continued the climb. He passed through 5,000 meters. He passed through 7,000. The engines did not fade. The supercharger system maintained power delivery at altitudes where German bomber engines had already begun to lose their breath. He leveled off at operational altitude and pushed the throttles forward to combat power. The speed built and built and built. Lerche watched the airspeed indicator move past numbers that no German bomber of equivalent size could approach. The Mosquito at altitude was running at speeds that placed it in the same category as the fastest single-engine fighters in the Luftwaffe's inventory, and it was doing this while carrying a useful internal bomb load capacity, while carrying enough fuel for a long-range mission, while carrying 2 crew in a comfortable cockpit. The aircraft was not slightly faster than its German counterparts. The aircraft was decisively, unambiguously, structurally faster, and the structural reason was the wooden monocoque construction that had allowed the designers to save the weight and the aerodynamic drag that German engineering, locked into the metal stressed skin philosophy of the late 1930s, simply could not match. He tested the handling. The controls were responsive throughout the envelope. The aircraft rolled cleanly. It pitched without complaint. It held its nominal heading in cruise without constant trim adjustment. Lerche put it into a series of progressively more demanding maneuvers, testing the structural limits, testing the controllability at high speed, testing how the aircraft behaved when pushed toward the edges of what it was designed to do. It absorbed every test. There were no surprises. There were no moments when the aircraft did something unexpected, something that required quick corrective action, something that revealed a gap between the design assumption and the operational reality. The Mosquito flew the way an aircraft flies when its designers have done their homework and then refined the result through hundreds of hours of operational feedback. He simulated an engine failure. He pulled one Merlin back to idle and feathered the propeller and assessed what the aircraft would do on a single engine. The answer was that it would continue flying without drama. The asymmetric thrust was manageable. The rudder authority was sufficient. A pilot who had absorbed combat damage and lost an engine could bring this aircraft home from deep inside enemy territory. He restored the second engine. He continued testing. He flew for the better part of an hour, working systematically through every flight regime, every system, every characteristic that mattered. And as he flew, the conclusion that had been forming during the walk-around assembled itself into something complete and inescapable. The Mosquito was not a propaganda toy. The Mosquito was not the desperate improvisation of a country that had run out of materials. The Mosquito was the most carefully engineered, most aerodynamically refined, most operationally capable aircraft of its type in the world. It was faster than any Luftwaffe fighter at altitude. It was almost impossible to intercept under any circumstances short of being directly above it at the moment it crossed your patrol zone. And it was being built in numbers that Germany could not approach, in industrial capacity that lay completely outside the strategic supply chains that German Air Force planning had been designed around. He landed, he taxied back, he shut down the engines, the ground crew gathered around. They asked, in the casual professional way that ground crews always ask, what he thought of the flying piano. And Lerche, who had spent the last 90 minutes revising every assumption he had carried onto the tarmac that morning, said something that those mechanics would remember for the rest of their professional lives. He said that the aircraft was extraordinary. He said that it was one of the finest machines he had ever flown. He said that whoever had built it had understood something about aviation that German industry was no longer producing. Then he walked to his office and began to type. The report that emerged from his typewriter over the following days ran to roughly 40 pages. The exact length is part of the institutional memory at Recklin rather than a surviving archive document, because the original report, like so many wartime German technical documents, was lost or destroyed in the chaos of 1945. But the men who saw it, the engineers and operational officers who read it and discussed it in the months after Lerche submitted it, remembered the length specifically. 40 pages on a single captured aircraft. 40 pages of technical analysis, performance data, comparative assessment, strategic implication. 40 pages because the aircraft demanded it. 40 pages because compressing it would have meant leaving out things that the Luftwaffe needed to know. The technical sections documented everything Lerche had found in the air. The climb rate, the cruise speed at various altitudes, the fuel consumption, the handling characteristics, the behavior under simulated combat conditions, the single-engine performance, the cockpit ergonomics, the systems integration, the visibility, the control harmonization, all of it precise, all of it supported by his observations from the flight, all of it expressed in the careful neutral prose of an engineer recording empirical facts rather than expressing opinions. The structural sections documented the wooden construction in detail, the monocoque fuselage, the laminated wing, the bonding adhesives, the manufacturing approach that allowed thousands of small woodworking shops across Britain to produce sub-assemblies that were then brought together at final assembly plants, the implications for production capacity, the implications for damage tolerance, the implications for repair in the field. Lerche, who had flown German aircraft whose damage tolerance was theoretical because the replacement parts were not arriving from the bombed-out factories, understood viscerally what the Mosquito's distributed production base meant for the war the Allies were now fighting. But the most dangerous sections of the report, the sections that made 40 pages necessary and that ensured the document would be quietly buried by the time it reached the offices of the men who needed to read it, were the strategic implications. Because Lerche, sitting at his typewriter at Rechlin in November 1943, did what professionals like him had been doing throughout the war and what their superiors had been refusing to act on. He told the truth about what the captured aircraft meant. It meant that the British and their American allies were now operating an industrial philosophy that German industry could not match. Not because German engineers were inferior, they were not. Not because German workers were less skilled, they were not. But because the entire German aviation industry had been built around the metal stressed skin construction philosophy of the late 1930s, and that philosophy was now fighting a war it could not win against an opponent who had developed an alternative philosophy that exploited industrial capacity Germany did not possess. Every Mosquito built in Britain was built in a factory that in Germany would have been producing furniture. Every Mosquito assembler was a craftsman who in Germany would have been making cabinets. The British had identified a strategic resource, the woodworking industry, that the German planning system had simply not registered as a military asset, and they had turned it into a production base that ran in parallel with their main aluminium aircraft factories, doubling their effective output without consuming any of the strategic materials that German industry was desperate to deny them. And the aircraft this parallel industry was producing was not a second-rate substitute for a metal aircraft. It was, in many respects, superior, faster, lighter, more aerodynamically refined, cheaper to build per unit, faster to manufacture from raw material to flying aircraft. The Mosquito was not a wartime improvisation, it was a strategic weapon, and the country that had built it had understood for years what it was doing, while the country trying to shoot it down had spent those same years dismissing the threat as a piano factory experiment. Lerche wrote all of this. He documented it. He set it down in 40 pages of precise, professional, unflinching prose. He signed his name. He submitted the report through the proper channels, and he waited for the response. The response, when it came, was the response that German institutional culture by late 1943 had perfected. The report was acknowledged. The technical sections were noted. The performance data was filed in the appropriate Recklin archives. And the strategic implications, the 40 pages of analysis that mattered most, were quietly set aside on the grounds that they were excessively pessimistic, that they had been written by a test pilot whose perspective was necessarily narrow, that the broader strategic picture was the responsibility of officers with more comprehensive intelligence access. The conclusions Lerche had reached were not refuted, they were simply not engaged with. Within weeks of the report's submission, the Luftwaffe High Command had effectively buried it. Within months, the document existed mainly in the memories of the men who had read it before it went into the filing cabinet. Within a year, the strategic situation Lerche had predicted had developed exactly as he had described, with Allied air power dominating German airspace, with Mosquitoes ranging at will over the Reich, with Pathfinder squadrons leading bomber streams to their targets with surgical precision, with night fighter Mosquitoes hunting Luftwaffe interceptors in the darkness. Everything Lerche had documented in November 1943 had come true, and the report that had predicted it was nowhere in the operational discussions about what to do. If you are someone whose father or grandfather served in the air war, on either side, in bombers or fighters, on the ground or in the air, in maintenance, in supply, in intelligence, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments below. What unit? What aircraft? What theater? What did they actually see, and what did they refuse to talk about? Those details live in families and in memory, not in any archive. They belong in the record more than anything that I can research and read out, and the comments section is exactly the place where that kind of remembrance can happen. The Mosquito itself, the captured aircraft that Lerche had flown that November afternoon, continued in German service for some time. It was paraded through the Circus Rosarius circuit, displayed to fighter units who were trying to learn how to intercept the operational Mosquitoes ranging over Germany. The German pilots who saw it studied the cockpit, the controls, the construction. They were shown everything that Lerche had documented. What they were not shown, because no display could teach it, was how to build the aircraft. That was the lesson the Mosquito could not teach on a runway. The captured airframe sitting on a German airfield was a teaching aid. The factories spread across Britain that were producing the operational fleet were the actual weapon, and those factories were not going to be visible to any German fighter pilot who walked around the captured machine and tried to understand what he was looking at. The strategic verdict on the Mosquito is by now a matter of settled historical record. By the end of the war, de Havilland and its licensed subcontractors had built more than 7,000 Mosquitoes across all variants. The aircraft served as a bomber, a night fighter, a pathfinder, a photographic reconnaissance platform, a fighter bomber, an anti-shipping strike aircraft, and a high-speed transport. It conducted some of the most precise and most strategically significant raids of the entire war, including the famous low-level attacks on Gestapo headquarters in Oslo and Copenhagen, the daylight pinpoint strikes on V-weapon launch sites, the Pathfinder missions that guided Bomber Command's main force to its targets with a precision that had not been available before the Mosquito's arrival. By any operational metric, the aircraft was one of the most successful designs of the war, and the German response to it, traceable directly through the reports that men like Lerche wrote, and the institutional refusal to engage with what those reports said, was a long, slow institutional failure. The Luftwaffe never developed an equivalent wooden high-speed aircraft. The German experiments with wooden construction, the various late-war projects that attempted to copy the Mosquito's basic philosophy, were rushed, under-resourced, started too late, and produced no operational aircraft of comparable capability before the war ended. The piano factory that Göring had mocked in 1942 had, by 1945, produced an air force capability that Germany never matched. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war. He surrendered to British forces in May 1945 and spent a brief period in their custody, where the Royal Air Force Test Establishment at Farnborough, with the same professional curiosity that had once driven Lerche himself, very politely asked him to tell them everything he knew about flying captured German aircraft. He told them, he went home, he became a civilian engineer, and in 1977 he published a memoir describing his wartime testing career. The captured aircraft he had flown, the reports he had written, the institutional responses he had received. The memoir is one of the most valuable primary sources on the Luftwaffe's captured aircraft program that survives. It is detailed, it is professional, it is characteristically unsparing about the gap between what he had documented and what his superiors had been willing to act on. He died many years later, having outlived almost every test pilot of his generation, and having, as the record correctly states, crashed not a single aircraft across more than 120 distinct types. He was asked once, in an interview during the late 1970s, what flying the captured Allied aircraft had taught him about the war he had served in. He gave an answer that has to be read carefully to be understood. He said that flying enemy aircraft had not made him love the enemy. He had been and remained a German officer who had done his duty in a uniform whose politics he had not chosen. But it had made him understand, with a clarity he had not previously possessed, that the war his country was fighting could not be won. And he had understood this, he said, in the cockpit of the captured Mosquito at Recklin in November 1943, with the Merlin engines pulling the wooden aircraft through the cold air above Germany, doing exactly what their British designers had built them to do, while the report he was already mentally composing assembled itself in his head sentence by sentence. That is the verdict. Not the verdict on the Mosquito, although the Mosquito's verdict is unambiguous. The verdict on what the Mosquito represented. A British aviation industry that had identified an unused strategic resource, woodworking capacity, and turned it into a production base that German planning had not anticipated and could not match. A British engineering culture that had been willing to violate the conventional wisdom of metal aircraft construction and back the violation with serious resources. A British Air Ministry that had eventually, after initial resistance, allowed the heretical idea to develop into the operational weapon that was now defeating the Luftwaffe in its own airspace. And on the German side, an institutional culture that had built its identity around engineering supremacy, around metal construction, around the assumption that German methods would always prevail over Allied improvisations. A culture that, when confronted with empirical evidence from its own most experienced test pilots that the assumption was wrong, had filed the evidence and continued asserting the supremacy. Lerche's 40 pages had named this failure precisely. The pages had been read by men whose careers depended on not naming it, and the pages had then gone into the filing cabinet, where they remained until the war and the regime that had built that filing cabinet were both gone. The Luftwaffe did not lose the air war over Europe because its pilots lacked skill. It did not lose because its individual aircraft were technically inferior in pure performance terms. The Bf-109G and the FW-190 were excellent machines. It lost because it was fighting a war of industrial sustainability with a philosophy designed for a war of tactical decision, against an opponent that had identified strategic resources German planning had not registered and built an aircraft industry around them that German aircraft industry could not approach. The captured Mosquito Lerche flew at Recklin in November 1943 was a single airframe. The 40 pages he wrote about it were a single report. The institutional response to that report was a single instance of a much larger pattern. But the pattern, traced carefully through the documents and the memoirs and the post-war interviews, is the actual story of how the Luftwaffe was defeated. Not in the sky, where its pilots fought to the end with the skill and the bravery that their training had given them, but in the factories and the planning offices and the institutional cultures where the war had been decided long before the pilots ever took off. Lerche climbed into the enemy's most heretical weapon, flew it for 90 minutes through the November sky over Rechlin, walked back to his office and told the truth about what he had found. The truth ran to 40 pages. The truth contained the future of the war, and the system above him filed it and continued asserting that the future would be different. That is the part of his story that should still resonate 80 years later. Not what the engineer wrote, what the system above him refused to hear. If this forensic investigation gave you a clearer picture of how the air war over Europe was actually decided, not the version in the official histories, but the version that test pilots like Lerche wrote down when they were being honest, hit the like button. Not as a favor to a channel, but because this kind of history, the story of professionals who saw clearly and reported honestly and watched their reports go into filing cabinets, deserves to reach the viewers who care about getting the past right rather than getting it comfortable. Subscribe if you want the next investigation, the next case file, the next time the answer was there in writing and the institution couldn't read it. And remember this: wars are decided by industrial systems and strategic resources and institutional cultures, by the willingness of people in charge to engage with what their own best professionals are telling them. The men who flew the aircraft on both sides were not numbers. They had names, they had skills, they had a clarity about what they were seeing that the officers above them often did not possess. Hans-Werner Lerche climbed into a wooden aircraft built by a country he was at war with, flew it honestly, and wrote 40 pages about what he had found. He deserves to be remembered for that, not as a symbol of any cause, but as what he was. A professional who told the truth in a system that had forgotten how to read it.